Welcome everyone, welcome to Sotheby's Institute, thanks for coming along. We've titled this talk tonight, Warhol Then, Now and Forever. I decided, we thought this would be a rather nice way of approaching Andy, to tie in with the Whitney show. A few years ago I was asked to write a piece for a magazine about Andy's time capsules, and I didn't know much about these things at that stage. But I was asked to write a piece about them and investigated them a little bit, and they were very intriguing to me and kind of made me think a little bit more about what endures in Warhol's work. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the time capsules, but essentially at some point during Warhol's career, when he was moving studio, I understand, from 33 Union Square West to an address on Broadway. 860
to be precise.
Exactly.
Third floor.
You were there quite a bit.
Yeah, I can go on all about the time capsules, trust me.
Andy decided he needed to move his stuff, so he started to put it into to time capsules, or into boxes, sorry. And all kinds of everything went into these boxes, and I was fascinated to learn. I mean, the sorts of things that went into these boxes were taxi receipts, wig tape, a valentine from Allen Ginsberg, an invitation to the Vice President's housewarming. He had a letter from his florist about his overdue account, a mummified foot, a velvet dress worn by Jean Harlow, and one box of these had only pizza dough, which was now covered in weevils after years of being stored. And there were 612 of these. And
well, just to correct you,
Laura, this is going to happen a lot.
When we moved from 33 Union Square West,
right,
to 860 Broadway, which is literally across the square. One was west, we moved north. Andy had a private studio on the 8th floor where he kept everything, all the stuff he never threw away, which were in big boxes. This is his private studio, so when Andy, knowing he didn't like to spend money on movers, we were the movers. I said, this is unwieldy to carry big boxes. I mean, it's crazy, we can't do it. So I went to A&A Carton Company, got an F42 or a 42F box, which once it's made, it's manageable. So then I said, these could be time capsules. So the first one, of course, he lit up on that, he could save even more. What we did, he had stuff from the 50s and 60s, and they were actually moving boxes. So I made a box in what was my alcove office, which I shared with Andy, when we moved into 860 Broadway, and I dated it with the date when it was made. And then we filled it, I dated it when we closed it. That becomes the time capsule. So some are really interesting, some are really boring. But we also had, I think, 6 or 8 chests I got on Orchard Street, which we put in more stuff. That's where the mummified cake is and all the other stuff.
Well, the reason let me introduce you. Let me get that.
Why not?
I'll do that.
Why should you?
Just give me a second. Well, the reason I came back to this idea was I was curious about what endured. I mean, what is... what's worth keeping and what isn't? Is pizza dough worth keeping? Is it art? Is it not? And what is the stuff that we will remember, and what is the stuff that Andy thought was worth remembering? So that's why I assembled this panel here tonight.
Well, I don't remember the pizza dough, so I have to find out where you got it.
I'm sure that was there. That
Okay,
slipped you. Maybe you were off sick.
Yeah?
Maybe you were off sick that day.
Why don't you introduce us now?
I'll do that. So here is Vincent Fremont to my right. Vincent began working with Andy Warhol in the summer of 1969, and for nearly 20 years he worked for the factory in various capacities as Vice President of Andy Warhol Enterprises and the Executive Manager of the Andy Warhol Studio. In the 1970s and 1980s, he produced and developed video, TV and film projects, and he was one of the founding directors of the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, and was involved in establishing the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh. To his right is Sally King-Nero, who is the Curator of Drawings and Photography and the Executive Editor of the catalogue Raisonné for the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts. Sally King-Nero began working for the Andy Warhol Foundation in 1991, creating an inventory of Warhol's drawings, and became Curator of Drawings and Photographs in 1992. And prior to moving to New York, she was Director of Exhibitions at the Maryland Institute College of Art. And to her right, who you all probably know, Stephan Pascher is faculty on the MA program in Contemporary Art here at Sotheby's. Stephan is an artist, writer and educator. His work has been exhibited and collected in the US and abroad, most recently at Henry Taylor's in Los Angeles, at Artist Space at the Kunstmuseum Basel, at Culture Guest Lisbon, The Orchard in New York, and CIFO in Miami. His writings appear in After All, Merge, Springer, and Metropolis, and many other places. So thank you. Let's give him a round of applause. So Vincent, you've launched into stuff, but
I've already interrupted you how many times?
That's a few times. I'll let you talk
I
now.
apologize.
That's good.
I've had too much coffee.
Okay. What you started working for Andy in 1969 when you were 19.
18. Freelance.
How did that? How did we get those jobs? How did that happen?
I'll do the short version because my wife always says, like, I have various versions. Short one, I came to New York City with two friends from high school. We looked like a rock and roll band. I had hair down here. We had a kind of an LA androgynous look. Big problem was we didn't play instruments. We were called the Babies. We had a manager, and my two friends had met Andy 6 months before. We had been living in LA. We were getting tired of it in LA. We had this absurd idea to get involved in the music business. We were hanging out with the GTOs, which were the Girls Together Outrageously. The first probably organized girl groupies they had one record that Frank Zappa produced, and they were, I had a crush on two of them. Miss Mercy adopted the Babies into the GTOs with Miss Christine and probably Miss Pamela. So we left them and came to New York, and then within 2 or 3 days went to Andy's studio. And strangely enough, the security getting to Andy's studio was minimal, with the Dutch door, which the top was open. There was a desk, maybe Joe D'Alessandro was sitting there. I think my friends must have called in advance, and that's when I first met Andy. So that's August of 1969, and we arrived the weekend of Woodstock, just to give you an idea of the period. So I got the room at the Chelsea Hotel. We all ran out of money within 3 or 4 days, and I ended up working at the Paradox restaurant, the Mayakobuck restaurant in East Village.
What was he like as a boss?
Well, at that point, I only freelanced, and I was a big fan of his in high school. My parents were artists. I was aware of his art from an early age because my father was in a gallery on North La Cienega nearby Esther Robles Gallery, near the Ferris Gallery, where Andy had his Campbell Soup Can show that launched his career in a big way. So I've been seeing his movies at the Cinematheque 16. My parents got divorced, so I come up to LA to go with my father and stepmother. I couldn't go myself because I was underage. I couldn't get into to the trip when the Velvet Underground came because I was too young. But I was aware of all this. So by the time I got out of high school, I was pretty well versed in his world. And then I got to meet him, and he interviewed me that afternoon. I met him for like 2 hours. He had a big Euro tape recorder. It was before the little Sony TCs. So if you could be a good talker, if you're male, and I had really androgynous look, he was interested. He was a great interviewer, and he asked a lot of questions. And then I worked at the Paradox and ended up at Max's Kansas City, which was a bar that he made famous. So you go at midnight to the back room. We got into Max's quite easily because Mickey Ruskin saw our look. We were a band, and Danny Fields, who was the manager of the Ramones, and Iggy Stooge calls us the group that came from nowhere that did nothing. So that's how we got branded immediately. But we actually wanted to make films. I wanted to be a filmmaker. So
you were doing all kinds of everything for him.
Yeah, I mean,
eventually.
I had to go back to LA to get out of the draft. The lottery in 1969-70. My birthday was number 26, so I knew I was going to get that letter. So I went back to LA, dealt with the draft, and I didn't have any money, so it took me almost a year to get back to New York, reconnect. So Andy asked me to go on full-time roughly January of 1971. And when I say full-time, that means I got the keys to Andy's studio, and then you got the broom. I swept, ran messages, answered phones. You start from the bottom. And by 1974, I was made vice president, and it just continued. The more he saw what you could do and trust you, the more responsibility he gave you.
I get the feeling that he gave this impression of being, of running chaotic business affairs, and I mean this kind of fascinates me in terms of what he he thought he was doing and what he thought he was preserving and what he was making of significance. And he does, he did seem to give an air of being.
Well, see, that's that kind of mythology that's written, because writers they read about other writers, and becomes this geometric kind of form of mythology that gets to be built out. Yes, so I wasn't at the Silver Factory, so that was already over. I meet him roughly a year after the assassination attempt by Valerie Solanas, which was June of 1968. I met him in August of '69. There was a changing of the guard, so to speak, at that point. Fred Hughes and Paul Morrissey were his managers. Fred had a high aesthetic, was all about the art. Paul Morrissey was all about the film and wanted to start a film. It was kind of like the studio system of Hollywood. So we had, instead of, we had drag queens, and Joe D'Alessandro was like the leading man. After Andy's assassination, Paul made, or when Andy was recovering, Flesh, and then he makes Trash, and then Heat. Those are all Paul Morrissey films produced and presented by Andy. So Andy steps back as a director. But we had kind of that studio system, and Paul didn't like contemporary art, which Andy was doing. So you had this kind of, and it was a transition. There were a lot of people hangers-on. There was pretenders. Because this whole thing with Andy's, everybody wanted who could get closest to Andy's attention. How do you find your niche with him? It happened at the Silver Factory, because I talked to Billy Name and people like that later, and it happened when I came around. But I was hired by Andy, as opposed to people coming around pretending like they're, intellectual property lawyers or this one or that one. So Fred and Paul eventually get rid of most people, and then you have a structure. So that craziness, we're structured.
But there was a lot going on. I mean, there was Interview magazine, there was Andy Warhol TV at one stage, there was the portrait commissions, which people were hunting for because they were very lucrative. There was a lot to control. Could you really keep track of it all? Or was there a structure to keep track of all of that stuff?
Well, Andy was very intuitive, and why he picked me, I was there running Andy's studio, so he could leave and go to Europe and call me from wherever he was, or, did the checks come in, or, did you call? I made sure everybody was working well. The mice, kids play. We're the kids. We were all in our early 20s. So I kept the studio part in motion. The interview was fledgling, but the interview started having freelance people and stuff. It was different. Bob Colacello, Glenn O'Brien were the two editors, and then Bob Colacello eventually becomes the editor, starting around 73, 4, where it transformed from a film journal into what it was, a fashion and gossip and that format, which was what Andy wanted. So, go ahead. Sorry.
What did you think? What did Andy think he was running? Was he an artist, or was he a filmmaker, or was he an entrepreneur? Or
he was all of that. He was first and foremost an artist. I mean, that's, even though he pretended he wasn't. Sometimes he wanted to be a machine, a robot. He was very hands-on in everything he did, and he was very controlling in everything he did. So he played it like he didn't care. He didn't know anything. He knew everything, down to the paper clips.
So when he died, that things were a lot more ordered than we might imagine.
Yeah, we had a will. I had it. He gave it to me. It was in my desk. I never thought I would take it out 5 years after it was done, or 6 years after it was done. We met with the business advisors every year. Andy would show up for 10 minutes, ask the right questions, and leave. And then Fred and I would stay, go through everything, and then report back to him later to debrief what we were going to do instructionally. Andy had a big fear of never having any money. So this was the constant, being from a very poor background, this was something that was driving him. But he was an astute businessman naturally. But he was also very intuitive to hire Fred Hughes, who was like 26 when he was hired, to be his main business manager and set up all the exhibitions. Fred brings in the socialites from Europe and high society, and it starts to help the portrait business with Bruno Bischofberger, Andy's main dealer, and that was the reason they did that. That was a way to get bread and butter to run all the other operations that we were doing, because we had to pay for the magazine, later the TV show, but the TV show doesn't start till '79 in earnest. So
it sounds like money kept the need to pay for all this sort of kept it going, rather than Andy's specific desire to do one thing I don't want to be a filmmaker and just devote my.
Yeah, but Andy wanted to be involved in all art medias. I mean, all the mediums. He loved key things. He loved creativity. He liked creative people. Therefore, he liked a lot of crazy people, which equates to creative people, and that one of them almost killed him. That's the double-edged sword of having lots of people come around. It changed. The security changed. We put a bulletproof door in at 33 Union Square West, right off the elevator. So when the doors opened, you had a little glass bulletproof window you looked in. Very intimidating, except people did penetrate once in a while. But that's after we had an armed robbery, the bulletproof door went in. Not before. The Dutch door was... So we did take that door over to 860 Broadway, put up sheetrock, put the bulletproof door as the door. Meanwhile, you could kick through the sheetrock if crazy people had understood that. We had a Keith Saunier sculpture that was CB radios up above, so it was always squawking, so it kind of made people a little bit nervous, and so it gave an air of high security.
Sally, Andy died in 1987, and you joined the foundation 4 years later to inventory the drawings and became curator of drawings and photographs shortly after that.
Yes.
Did it seem chaotic to you, or was there the same kind of order that Vincent sees?
It wasn't that it was chaotic. It was actually pretty well in hand. They just needed more people to inventory things. At the same time that we were trying to inventory all of the artworks, they were also trying to decide, make decisions about the Andy Warhol Museum. So that may be why it seemed chaotic, because I think a lot of things changed, in terms of what was going to the museum, who was running the museum,
Well, we had to put a collection together, so we couldn't really sell anything or do anything. Because Fred Hughes and I were in Andy's will were instructed to continue doing business as usual through the estate. Once the estate, which the main beneficiary of the estate was the Andy Warhol Foundation, because in the will it said for me and Fred and John Warhola to create a foundation a charitable foundation for the advancement of the visual arts. So we had to define it. Fred took the lead, and so we did all that. That takes time, and then the art market tanked in between all the stuff. So all the art's transferred between 1990 and 1991, right, from the estate to the foundation. Something like that. By 91, I become the agent for the...
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, but we were still inventory.
Yeah, we had to hire we hired people.
It was huge.
Well, I hired Beth just because I knew she used to babysit my daughters, and I said, you can count, so come on in. Because you started to have to count the drawing. It's real
they
time.
started with the
time.
Paintings, because that obviously was where,
Right.
the interest was. So the paintings were inventoried by the time I got there.
But there was already a catalogue raisonné begun. So
Yes.
Thomas Amann had started a catalogue raisonné 10 years before that, and so there was already some kind of...
But it hadn't really...
He was gathering data,
Yeah,
but
but
he wasn't really going through the studio, and it was more what was out publicly. He's tracking, collectors, things coming up at auction, that sort of thing. But as far as I know, until Andy died, I think that's when Thomas came in and was able to see what was still left in the studio.
Thomas Amann was Warhol's principal dealer in Europe. Is that right? And
Well, one of them.
of.
But he
Right.
comes, as I said to you earlier, he comes out of the Bruno Bischofberger Gallery. He starts his own business and became very close to Andy. And usually, most dealers, you see them, you have dinner, you make a deal, friendly. Thomas was closer with us than any of the dealers, and in fact, Andy rented the second floor of his townhouse mansion on 66th Street to show artwork. So Andy got to see Picasso's, and so Andy loved it. I don't know what the business relationship was between them, but it was an unusual situation where a dealer has access to an artist's home. And Andy didn't put any of his own art in the house. He had all the other artists he collected, and then Thomas was doing something. But they had a very close relationship. And I said to you earlier, Thomas Amann was really a gentleman's dealer. I mean, really top quality.
But also, the reception for Warhol in the 70s and 80s was more in Europe. He was more popular in Europe than he was in the United States. In the United States, it was sort of after the 60s, well, that's it. So he was showing in Italy, he was showing in Germany. The Germans loved him. Switzerland.
They took it more seriously.
Yes. Most of the big shows for the series that he was doing in the 70s took place in Europe. I mean, I think the first show that he does at Leo Castelli is 81. He shows the Hammer and Sickles. This is after
Right.
the 60s. I mean, there's small shows here and there, but
You're still-
and that sort of thing.
You're still working on the catalogue raisonné, and that's going to go on. It seems
Yes.
like it's going to go run and run.
Yes.
Is it different working on it now than it was?
Well, it's a lot easier. Now with the internet, you can search
Right.
things, find things.
Yeah.
When we started in 93, they basically transferred the information that Thomas Ammann Fine Art had been collecting, and it was like a DOS program, so it had to be translated. And we started with that information, and we've since built a much better system. And it's easier to track things now.
Right. You were in Europe recently working on it. So
Yes.
you see each and everything individually, or I mean, what is
Yes.
can you describe the process
Well, the
of?
goal is, for the catalog raisonné, we try to examine every painting, drawing, and sculpture. Prints, there's a separate catalog raisonné. Photographs is a separate thing. So we put together these trips by the amount of work that's in a particular place.
Right.
And then we go and try to see everything. It's exhausting, but it's really fun. And we are looking at how the paintings are made, what the layers of the paint are, where the silk screens are. We record all of that. We also found in the archives, probably in a time capsule, lists of the paint that he was using. So with the colors. So we made color chips. And when we go to look at a painting, we don't just say, well, it's blue. We say it's phthalo blue or it's cerulean blue, because it gives us a better sense when we come back of what we're looking at, what colors he liked.
And on the basis of this, you can make decisions about what is included in the catalogue raisonné and what doesn't make the grade, or
Yeah.
or these you're not making decisions about authentication, or they
Well,
don't
we're
filter
not really
you.
authenticating, no. We collect data, we collect information about paintings, their provenance, their exhibition history. If something doesn't have any of those qualities, then we have to look into it further.
Right. I know you're, I mean, this is a difficult area to discuss, and I'm not sure what we can discuss and what we can't. I don't know if any of you, to what extent the rest of you are aware, but the Andy Warhol Foundation used to run an authentication board, which was dissolved in 2012?
October 2011.
2011. Which you remember very precisely.
Yes, I
You remember the day and the hour. And it was dissolved because, on the one hand, the foundation wanted to concentrate on its charitable giving, but also because, I think it's fair to say, it was attracting an extraordinary amount of litigation, which was sapping the foundation's resources, because work would be submitted to the authentication board, and its owners felt that they had strong grounds to believe that this was Andy's work, and it might come back denied. And on the basis of that, they might launch a legal challenge, because obviously the value the authentication board held, the ability to make and break a lot of money there.
There was a form that you signed which said, we will give you an opinion.
Right.
But you sign it so that you don't sue us. But there were people that went around that to find other ways
Right.
to sue.
A lawyer will always find a way.
Yes, there's always a way.
Exactly.
There's always a way. How did you how do you navigate this now? I mean, to my mind, the catalogue raisonné does the same thing. It is a document which details what is accepted as authentic and what isn't. But in what way is it separate than the board than what the authentication board once did?
We don't give opinions. In other words, we used to give opinions. We do not give opinions now, and we don't give. We don't provide any information that's not already published in the catalog raisonné.
I believe that the authentication board were very cagey about their rationales anyway, because I mean, for good reason, they didn't want to explain the grounds on which they were denying authentication to work, because they didn't want to supply more information to forgers. And of course, Warhol's work can be easy to forge.
Not really.
So if you know exactly how it's put together.
Yeah, you don't want a roadmap.
Right.
So, but I have to say that I was a consultant on the authentication board. I helped set it up. There were far more works of art authenticated than not authenticated, and people did have an opportunity to make a case, and there was opportunities where a painting which I felt was more inclined, was unusual, was one-off. They did their research, so we finally found the source material at the Andy Warhol Museum, and the decision was reversed. So there was always that opportunity. But the problem with when the art world is such a big business now, it's gotten bigger since Andy died. But we live in a very litigious society, so you can threaten people, that you're going to sue, and this becomes this ongoing. Besides the money that's involved, it's draining, it's negative, and I thought the authentication board did a great job, but it depends what side you're sitting on. But now the catalog raisonné, Sally and Neil,
Right.
have done an amazing job. It's very detailed, as you can hear about colors, and they go look at everything. They're doing great scholarship.
Sally, do you feel a continuing pressure on that?
No, I mean, we constantly get requests, but we kind of just tell people everybody gets the same information. We do not give opinions, and we cannot provide any information that's not already published.
Going back to what I talked about at the beginning about what endures and what doesn't. Do you feel that you are cataloguing one kind of Warhol rather than the phenomenon that there's very sort of a narrow element of his production that you are cataloguing, and then there is all this other stuff. There is the stuff that added up into the kind of aura or phenomena or myth, and that the objects are much more discrete.
Well,
because
there's several catalog raisonnés going on.
Right.
There's the film catalog raisonné, which is being sponsored by the Whitney. The print catalog raisonné has already been published. So we're doing paintings, drawings, and sculpture.
Things like boxes of pizza dough, whether that was pizza dough
the
or
time
not.
capsules? Well,
Yes.
that, thankfully, initially when the time capsules went to the Warhol Museum, actually before they went to the Warhol Museum, and I think, Vincent, you were one of the people, they started with the archivists, the Warhol Museum archivists, opening the boxes and cataloging them.
Because we wanted to get a sense of what was going to the museum, and I said I needed to see. So we opened about 60 boxes, spent a Friday tape recording what I was saying or what we were seeing, and it was being input in a computer. So this was a way to just get a cross-section. Because when people started working for Andy, the first job I'd give them sometimes to make a box. Now, if you can make that box, bring it over here. But Andy understood intrinsically. Andy saw it as in a way, a work of art. He always had this conceptual idea. He would, once it was amassed into many, many boxes, he would auction it off. But you wouldn't know what the contents were.
Oh, right.
So there was a university that was interested in acquiring it as an archive. He kept it close to him. When we moved to his last studio at 33rd Street, the Con Ed substation, we had these like 15-foot basement, and we were filling stuff up, and then he saw Yoko Ono had these white file cabinets as storage, so he got some white file cabinets. The white file cabinet lasted for a little bit. He went right back to the boxes, and he would just send everything down into this basement. So Fred was saying, this is valuable space we're filling up. Maybe we should get an off-site place for the boxes. He didn't want it that way. He wanted it where he could get to it. Because again, he was thinking maybe he would want to go into one, which he never did.
So there were so many of them, 600 of them. They couldn't possibly go through all of them. So when they went to the Warhol Museum, they didn't really have the staff to catalog them, to open each box and catalog it. So the Warhol Foundation provided funding so that they could hire a team just to catalog the time capsules. And they are thankfully completely cataloged, and I think that you can access it online, look at things online.
Had they not speeded it up, I wouldn't be here, Sally probably wouldn't be here, you'd just be waiting for those time capsules. But,
It sounded like a horrific job. I mean, the stuff that they were finding in there just seemed, it would sort of require hazmat suits to...
Oh, for heaven's sakes.
Well, I mean, the mummified foot...
Well, I don't know, but see, I don't know the mummified foot.
Okay.
There's two things.
There's a lot of that,
The
yeah.
pizza
There's a
dough,
lot of
I know there were
correspondence.
bugs, but I don't know, and that could have been created by some kind of bug, but I don't know. There was a cake, but that was in one of the chests. So, there was a whole box of just SAS uniforms,
But he also took the silverware
Yeah.
from
Well,
the Concorde.
Well, the Concorde, if you
whenever he
if
was
you
on a
travel
plane.
if you traveled with Andy on the Concorde, which I didn't, but Fred Hughes and Christopher Marcos and Bob Kojo, he made sure everybody took the flatware, all of it.
They have it all.
So
on a shelf.
when I opened the box and saw SAS uniforms, they had to have given it to him because people got to know that he liked to do this sort of thing. And in his diaries, you'll read when he comes out of a restaurant once, he is carrying flatware, so he gets out and the fork and knife hit the sidewalk, and the cop walks by and looks at him and just keeps on going. So he was notorious for he loved all that material. So one birthday, I called up the Waldorf Astoria and bought a set of different plates from different periods of the Waldorf, because that's the kind of thing he liked. He would not normally open a present. He'd take a little bit, peek inside, and then close it back up again, because that made it, a piece. Then he put it in storage. So at the time of his death, we were going through the house, in the guest room that I had stayed into while he was in Japan, you couldn't get into the, I think Fred was hit by boxes and stuff. It was just jammed. So Andy could be considered a hoarder in today's world.
I would say so, yes.
The formal dining room that Jed Johnson decorated and designed was a fancy warehouse. It was, whoa. And I hadn't seen it for years, but we had forced him to entertain in that dining room. He moved into there, but in '74, so like in the late '70s, we had a few dinners in that dining room. But after a while, when I went to pick him up, I just meet him in the kitchen or the foyer. He never saw, the doors were closed, and for good reason, because it was a warehouse.
There's a photograph of the dining room in the Sotheby's catalog.
Yeah.
The big sale
Right.
took place in 1989.
Huge sale.
Of his
Yeah.
huge sale.
Yeah.
And they have a photograph of the dining room.
Well, after it turned into a warehouse.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Sotheby's had almost every expert there except for Asian to look at stuff, because it was like layering. You didn't know. A security guard, Fred walks in, the security guard has his feet up on a table. Fred said, "Please take your feet off that." It was a Macintosh, and it sold at that time one of the highest amounts for a Macintosh piece of furniture. It was beautiful, but no one. I found a closed cover before striking, a little painting that somebody had leaned up against the wall. I said, I had to pick it up, make sure it didn't get stepped on. So
And that facet of him is yet another. There's Warhol as collector. There's all kinds of layers of this. Stephan, I wonder what, you as a working artist, I wonder what you find most inspiring in this. Because on the one hand, when I teach Warhol, we discuss the paintings, there are readings of the paintings which talk about them as being the work of, a really great formal intelligence, a man who really understands the techniques and language of painting in the late 50s and early 60s, and is a great critic of it. And yet, on the other hand, there's all this stuff in boxes. And there's the phenomena, there's the TV, there's the... so what is it that... I mean, I think critics today make a distinction between... You know, there's Warhol, the maker of objects, and then there's the Warhol, the business artist. As he said, you know, that after art there'll be business art, and that will be somehow better. What do you like? Is it the art or the business?
Gosh. Yeah, I can only sort of speak of, I mean, you know, you grew up as a kid, everybody knew who Andy Warhol was. You knew him before you formed your band. But then I went to art school, right? So when you go to art school, you study things, or you look closely, or you look differently at things. You put all these grids and structures onto them. Well, you know, the Warhol that I learned about or approached as an art student, and again, I was an art student, and he was still alive, but he'd already been, you know, it was like the period he was collaborating, running around with Jean-Michel Basquiat.
So that was what year? So you became
early 80s.
Early 80s, but I mean that's when you were studying here.
I was studying. No, yes.
Okay,
Not
here, but in the.
I was at Cooper Union those years, and I took some years of later off grad school in California, actually CalArts, and then he would pass away by then. But he was alive, and he was a presence. You could go to the Michael Todd room, and there was Andy Warhol with someone with interviews. It was kind of cool.
He was a publisher too.
That's right. He was a publisher.
Oh, so you were in the Michael Todd room. Good for you.
Oh yeah, sure.
So was I.
Sure.
Oh, you too. Look at that.
For you, this was
This has all disappeared. New York, as we knew it, is slowly being taken over.
You know what you're doing. So yeah, I mean, there's all that world, but again, you know, going to art school and learning art and this, so on and so forth. The art you look at, frankly, is before you guys entered the Andy Warhol scene. You know, it was the '60s, maybe late '50s when you start thinking about it. So I think there's three, perhaps, grids or ways to think about Warhol. It's looking at Warhol in the '60s, looking at Warhol as I did later in the early '90s, going to grad school as a postmodernist already. So you know, you've got this other way to think about Warhol because it's a different language than you would look at Warhol with if you were approaching your work in the '60s. And then there is the business art Warhol, which, like at that article in the New York Times the other week, was talking about, you know, invention of business art or business art business.
That one came out last week.
It was last week, right? Yeah, the one in the Times was one of those 3 or 4 that day, you know, where they talk about Coombs and Hearst and establishing a kind of model for the way big artists do business today or run their careers, actually. So, I mean, it's a very complicated scenario. So I'm still looking, you know, maybe the first 2 versions, which is at the work in the '60s and probably through some kind of postmodernism or something. So
Jack Bankowski did a show at the Tate Gallery a few years ago called Pop Life, which looked at that, which kind of canonized that idea of business art, and looked at it as an idea which then spreads through the work of Damien Hirst, of Koons, of Takashi Murakami, and it's something that's more visible now. I mean, you can understand a kind of lineage for it. I'm not sure that Warhol thought he was doing that, but
well, he says he was. If you read the A to B, it says hi B.
I think that
there's a chapter called Art, and there's no.
Yeah, but I think it was much more. It's more conscious now. It's sort of since people talk about that. I mean,
yeah, because Andy was a conceptual artist too.
Yes, I don't think of him as a pop artist. In fact,
and he had lots of ideas, and what he threw out there, people took literally sometimes, and when it was meant to be literal, and he played with the ideas, and that's the conceptual
very much so.
Side of him. But if you think about what Andy's studio was like, I wasn't there in the Silver Factory '60s, but the '70s, he only had one main art assistant, Gerard Malanga in the '60s, Ronnie Catrone in the '70s, and Jay Schreiber in the '80s up to the time of his death. And there were sub-assistants, 2 or 3, and then we would hire an artist to help stretch for an exhibition, because Andy'd rather give money to an artist than, you know, just bring anybody in. So Ronnie Catrone would call Stephen Mueller, who was a terrific artist. They would at Stretch. So there wasn't a lot of people. Where you have Jeff Koons has got like 40. If you've ever been to a studio, Jeff's a good friend. But it's like, makes your head spin. I mean, it's got, punch time clocks and it's big. It's just a different way of working. But Andy liked the idea of what was called the factory, doing, churning things out. And in fact, it was a lot smaller and more archaic in its sense, because he was there doing it. You see those pictures of Gerard, they're doing the squeegee, and Andy said he was going to be, going back to the thing of being a robot in a machine, the act of screening is hands-on. 70s, he's finger painting the backgrounds. I videotaped a lot of, knowing this was important, and it is now, because people can actually see him work. Because by the 70s, he was not interested in documentary teams filming him or photographing him work, but our in-house video could. Michael Netter first, then me, Michael and I working together, and by 73, I become the video department. I found my niche finally. So I produced all of Andy's television and video projects and co-directed some. But Andy wanted his hands into everything, going back to your idea of what kind of art. He believed in seeing. That's why he was interested in everybody creative. He was interested in dance, fashion, writers, poets. He collaborated with poets in the 60s. I mean, he did the cover of Fuck You magazine, Fuck You magazine of the arts, Ed Sanders magazine. He worked a lot with poets.
Stephan, I want to get an opinion from you. You were at an art school when he was, I mean, as you say, when you were there, you talked about the early 60s work. And
I think
stuff that made his reputation dip a bit in the States was a lot of the commissioned portraits, which I understand are getting a little more airtime in the Whitney show, and yet they are the thing that people look down on. Does that mean that you...
I don't know if it's down or up, and I wouldn't say that either. I mean, I was about to say a word that I don't like to use, which is kind of like the serious work. But I think serious art writers, the high church of art criticism, and artists, the way maybe it's taught through school, look at the 60s work. And that's not to discount later work, but the 60s work was an absolute watershed. Absolute watershed. Broke every rule, set new rules at every level. I mean, it was formally, technically innovative, conceptually innovative. As I said, I think I credit him as being more conceptual even than this pop word. It doesn't mean that much to me.
Well, he was labeled as a pop artist.
Right.
But people didn't understand that he was more than that.
Right. I mean, he invented reality TV. Absolutely. Probably with his tape recorder, but that's an argument there. But the Nothing Special TV show, which you probably that was later, so it helped.
That was another idea. He wanted to have a TV show called Nothing Special.
Oh, but the one where he has the video cam of the buzzer, the system where you get into the apartment building and it's all night on the cable show. Yeah, he's just running the video feed from the street.
Dinner?
No, from the street. He ran something which was from the street. He ran a feed from, some of these buzzers you can see the people downstairs.
He didn't want to do art videos. I mean, Leo Castelli Gallery had a division where they had artists, William Wegman and others, who were doing really good art videos. And he didn't want to do any of that. He wanted a real TV show. Mm-hmm. So we developed, Andy and I developed soap operas all through the 70s and a few other things. He didn't want it on access cable. Anton Parrick goes on first. Anton are kind of living parallel lives. We were videotaping some of the same people, some of the same characters. It's not till 1979 Andy decides to tell me to start a video studio. I find a director, Don Monroe, and we invest in a broadcast quality camera, and then we go, because that's all starts when Lauren Michaels comes to visit us, and was going because I've been working with one of pitching a show to Lauren Michaels, one of his producers, John Head, to do a TV version of Chelsea Girls. And I was excited, and I had Victor Bachris working on it, who became a biographer. So Lauren comes down and says he would give Andy one of the Saturday nights that they're not on. So that's broadcast. That's a big deal. Andy turns it down flat. So, and I was crushed, and Lauren Michael leaves, and Andy then goes, oh, well, I mean, if the show is any good, it's going to be my name that will be trash, basically. He didn't say trash, but it's my name, and I just don't think you're ready. But I want you to start a TV production company within his studio, in which I did. And it was the right thing. It was, again, learning from the bottom. Let's learn our own way to do this television. So I went out and got all the right, I talked to people who got the right lights, portable lights, cameras, director, and Andy and I were producers. So it's.
So, Stephan talked about feeling uncomfortable about saying that there's serious work and unserious work. And some people would say, maybe the portrait commissions weren't so serious, maybe the TV wasn't so serious. Vincent would obviously, I'll come back to you at the end.
Could I qualify that just
You
a
can,
little?
yeah.
I think it's also about looking at young artists' work versus older work, where it can be either repetitive or other forces operate on how they produce and what they produce. And that's true across the board. So if I were to look at, Bush Nauman's work or something in the 60s, I would look at the 60s. Because the more experimental works, the ones that have not found a market yet perhaps, the ones that arrive and people don't know where to put them, even critically, in terms of their reception, that's, and so what I'm saying is that might be true across the board. It isn't just Andy, first decade of his work is the most serious, but it's the most interesting in some weird way because it's also more fallible, less polished, and again, that's part of the experimentalism. And I don't want to cut you off with the question, but
No, it's fine.
when I talk about his innovation, we haven't talked about, but I also learned, primarily in grad school, that Andy was more important as a filmmaker than the objects. Of course, we're not going to discount the innovations he made with screening and the paintings and all that stuff. But the films were absolutely radical. And never have had a market. It's not about a market to make films.
What was the history of film that he created within his own studio?
He was involved with Jonas Mekas.
From silence to talkies to, see, Andy didn't care about plot, beginnings, middle, and endings, right? Mm-hmm. It was really about who could talk. Mm-hmm. So the plot lines, the plots come because of Paul Morrissey doing
right.
movies.
Well, and again, that arrives after the period I'm talking about. I'm talking about the long takes, the radicalism, the identity politics that are not just about sexuality, but they're about race and the kiss. He's got interracial couples kissing. Nobody in the early 60s could represent that in America. He's involved with the collective where the films, Jonas Mekas is giving him reels and film and all that stuff. He had no money or whatever, and he was making films. And they would be shut down every other week by the cops. You couldn't see the things that he was showing. And some of them were not that outrageous, but it was my understanding that he left something like 2,000 reels of film in Pittsburgh. Maybe that's film and video or something. And so again, serious or unserious, but the more experimental Andy is different. Becomes the kind of thing that an art student would look at, and I think it's part of the legacy. It is the forever part. It doesn't go anywhere.
When I don't know if you're professionally able to give an opinion because you have to judge everything equally. But how do you approach this issue, or how do you think about it personally when you're working through this myriad of objects?
I'd just like to say something about the portraits. I think if you go to see the portrait room at the Whitney Museum, you get a real chance to see early portraits, later portraits. And one of the things that's so interesting about them is that they do change, and that when he was working on a particular series, like the finger painting that Vincent mentions, you will find that the portraits from that time period are done in the same fashion. And then it changes. There's even portraits that have the oxidation background. I think they're very interesting. And I think you can't just say they're not serious. Because they're quite beautiful.
Controversy.
It doesn't matter who it is.
No, I didn't say
if
it was
you look
serious.
at it from a technical point of view, how they're painted.
No, I think I always show students in one of the classes the Emile D, D, you call him D, the painter's painting film, and the little clips are great, but the Ethel Skull stuff is fantastic, where she talks about how Andy took her down to one of those things, those photo booths, and was running around with coins to all of them. To me, that's absolutely extraordinary, and nothing unserious about
Still
that.
is a great documentary if you want to see a documentary about artists. Mm-hmm. Painter's painting is really good.
Yeah. But the Ethel Skull description of how Andy did a portrait is absolutely extraordinary. And the result is extraordinary, and how he produced it with photo booths. These have them anymore.
But the most extraordinary thing about it was that he cropped the photo booth and made individual screens with multicolors of all the different photo booth. How do you want to say different? The different shots. And so he was able then to put it together, and it could be any size. You know, it could change. You could put, you know, she's looking this way or that way and move it around. At one point, I think in Ethel Skull's house, it was a vertical. And then they decided to make it a horizontal, and they needed one more panel, so they had to come back and get another panel. But it's a fascinating painting for that reason, to me.
Somebody's looking at you.
Yes. Okay, why don't I have one more question about what will endure, but why don't I open that up to the floor a little bit, and we can answer some questions and maybe come around to that question of what actually will endure. So why don't I take a question? Any questions? Anyone? No questions.
Well, maybe-
How can this be?
Well, so
Well,
why don't you do what would you bring up? What is going to endure? Is that what you?
Yes. Well. What's going to endure? Vincent, tell me.
It's all enduring. Depending on what your interests are. I mean, to me, he's one of the great artists of the 20th century. So, and so you could look at the 60s, which, you know, I know what you're talking about. He was doing experiment. I mean, with the oxidation quote piss paintings, that's all about alchemy and changing. You know, you had to. He was using metallic paint, and then he didn't like one. He put another one. Ronnie Cotrone had to take B vitamins for his urine would turn more orange. And he was directing this, but this was a serious. But I mean, the place stunk in the back for quite a while. But that was in doing shadow paintings. But he does the shadows for Heiner Friedrich. This blew away all the art critics. They couldn't, you know, they hated him. Now they couldn't even attack the image because they didn't know what it was. But it was the most ethereal, beautiful 102 paintings to make one. So what they did was they just attacked him as a person, like his lifestyle, going out with, you know, rock stars or movie stars or celebrities of some kind. That's what he was documenting the world. So he's enduring because his name seems to pop up in articles that have nothing to do with art. All of a sudden, Andy's name is there.
Yeah.
And he's an easy target for certain people. He still polarizes. You know, the charlatan, this one, that one. You know, he was a true artist. He was a man that was. People are born once in a while in a century, the right time, the right place, and he had the right formula. I mean, you have to have like a recipe: magic, timing, luck, talent. He had all of it, and he was a very hard worker. So because of that, and because of being a visionary artists are ahead of the curve.
Right.
And people have to take time. So when they criticize the work, going back to the 70s, he was criticized as just a society portrait artist. Meanwhile, the royal courts of Europe for centuries were commissioning great artists to do portraits. He was astutely knowledgeable of art history, but also was a form of making money, bread and butter money, to, quote, bring home the bacon for the kids. We were the kids. And he felt responsible. We finally got a hand.
Go ahead.
Boxes. Was there intention behind what went into them, or were they just receptacles for whatever was in his pocket or on a table? Do you know why, other than being a hoarder?
Well,
So-
that's a good point, because there was a man who was going to be working on he was an archivist, and he asked that he actually didn't ask the question. He told me there was intent. And I said, "Oh, really?" So I take this box and I shift it. It's just moved its way. We did not think of layering, especially when we were moving. We didn't think, well, this was got to go here and this is going to go on top. This guy was going to tell me that was the intent. I was with Andy, with Ronnie Cotrone. We packed them. And then later, when the box is next to my desk, it's what Andy brings from home or what comes. I mean, I couldn't find contracts sometimes because they ended up in a time capsule. So Andy loved it, and when we were going through it before it went to the Andy Warhol Museum, we kept finding envelopes that weren't open. That generally meant it was a bill.
That's the other question. So
Yeah,
you shipped most of them to the museum without having viewed the
Right.
cabinet.
Well, because we
Would
never.
that be function of the will saying these go to the museum?
No, the will only. Andy's death was very abstract to Andy, so that wasn't gonna. There's no details. The only detail was for me, Fred, and John Warhol to create the charitable foundation for the advancement of the visual arts. Part of that being is he didn't want to give the money back to the government. They've been hounding him since 1972. The IRS audited us every year and took a couple of years off, but you had to sign a waiver.
It was after he did a picture of Nixon.
We did
wasn't
Nixon saying "Vote McGovern." I found the image for him. That was the first project I worked with him. But the Democratic National Committee forgot to mention that there was a gift tax he had to file, tax returns. We got slammed by and then arguably Andy was put on Nixon's list, but they started coming around soon after that was done. So 72, 73. It's a very famous print, if you've seen it. It's great because Nixon's face is kind of turquoisey greeny.
Yeah.
And
It's a horrible thing.
This is for Vincent and Sally, and I want your personal takes on it. If there's one thing, just one thing you wanted him, that he would want people to know for generations to come about himself, what would that one thing be? As someone who's been observing his work around the world and someone who was next to him working with him, I've always wondered, following his work and going to every retrospective and exhibition that I can, what is the one thing he would want generations to come to know about him?
you'd never get the answer, ever.
Reading his books, that's what.
Never. It was very, and he never very seldom spoke about his own art. Every once in a while somebody got to, I lobbied for Arthur Danto to interview him, because Andy was really tired of doing interviews. Donna DeSalvo got an amazing interview with Andy talking about his 50s work, maybe a year before he died. There are smatterings where he really talks about it. It's really interesting because he's actually very articulate about it, but he would never give you an answer. There's so many great paintings. People say, what's your favorite painting or period? Off the top of my head, for the disaster painting series, that's one of the great series. And the ambulance disaster out of that one is one of my favorites because you get to die twice. The irony is those paintings are strong. All those, they stay relevant. Even later work it stays relevant. People are still looking, younger people. And I don't assume that young people actually know who Andy is anymore, in part. You have to remember that I'm an old man now. It's like, no, but it's the generations. He looked to young people. He liked young people. He liked creative young people, and he wanted them all to work. And work hard. He told all the artists in the 80s, just keep working, keep painting. He helped start the New York Academy of Arts because he wanted them to learn how to actually draw the human body and everything else, because he was well trained in all that. Even though he put it all away, he had the tools.
Sally.
Well, I kind of think it's interesting how he's being reinterpreted. He had a camera with him. He took photographs constantly, and the photographs were recently given to Stanford University, and they're now available online. You can look at them. They've scanned them all.
In the contact sheets, too.
Yes, and one of the things that has come out of it is that it's kind of like he would have been great if he could have been part of social media, because he liked taking so many photographs and of everything, day to day. And so I kind of like that he's being reinterpreted.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you.
Anyone else?
That was my question. I was just going to ask from the Whitney retrospective, what is one thing you hope the public maybe learn something new about Andy?
Oh, I think you just have to go through slowly and look at everything. It's a fantastic opportunity to see that many works in one place, in your backyard, basically.
Ed.
I was just wondering, Vincent and Sally, if you thought that the breadth of Warhol's work was fully represented in the Whitney, and if it wasn't, what is it missing?
Sally?
Well, I think you have to look at the amount of space they have. Let's start with that. I think that she did try to represent, the later series. It would have been nice to see more, but from my point of view, I always want more. But I think it's well represented. I think it's good.
And Sally's right,
process.
because it's all the paintings and the drawings are primarily on just the 5th floor. I did a show with the Gagosian Gallery in 2006 called Cast a Cold Eye, which was paintings from 1972 to the end. Not every series, but Larry said, I'm building a building on opening a second gallery on 21st. We did that show in 4 months. We showed paintings that had never been seen and not been together ever, or hadn't seen each other. So that was 2 big spaces. So Donna is using one space, and she's done a brilliant job of seeing Andy's commercial work through his early personal drawings that he did, because he was doing fine art in the 50s. There's 3 Truman Capote drawings, which he showed at the Hugo Gallery, which was run by Alexandre Yolas, who becomes the champion of Andy's through the whole rest of his life. So there's all these connections, so you can learn new things. I don't know if people understand Andy's drawings so much, so I think there's opportunities. Donna did a great show, and it's not overhung, which is also good. I always want more as well. But
Yeah.
I think we could take another couple of questions if there are. Go ahead.
Having been one of, I think, New York's highest paid fashion illustrators early in his career, I was wondering what his opinion of the art students who were conceptual in nature and really didn't understand the figure as much as possibly a classically trained artist who then went on.
But so you're saying what Andy would think of young artists in the 50s or the 60s? Or
In the
who-
60s, who may have been working in certain media that might not have been as classically trained as he was.
He wasn't judgmental. He would have embraced it. He embraced artists. He liked, even though he didn't maybe not like the art, he wouldn't say. He liked the idea that people were creating art. So he didn't, he did a show with Leroy Neiman. Fred Hughes flipped out. And we all, but he didn't care. He wanted to do it. It was through the Coker Gallery, and it was a period of time. It's like everybody went, what? So he traded with artists. So I can't speak for him, to answer your question properly, but he was very open to artists. People came to see him. Conceptual artists came to see him. He traded through the 60s, 70s, and up till his death. He was trading his own art with it. So the younger painters, I think he was very happy that painting came back in, starting in the early 80s. And he was very supportive, but he wanted all those people to work all the time. So they were looking up to him. He was a workaholic, but he did this in a very positive manner. He approached his peers and everything else. He always said all the other pop artists were better than he was. He remained good friends. He never beat his chest about stuff. He was just interested in, he remained good friends with Roy Lichtenstein, Rosenquist, Rauschenberg. Even though Rauschenberg was more well-known before he was, he cared about art. Because again, going back, he was an artist first and foremost.
We'll take one more question.
I'm just wondering, in terms of younger artists, which you guys talked about, how did he influence, say, artists in the 80s who are also known for, a lot of, I guess, publicity or being associated with celebrities or other artists, such as like Julian Schnabel or Jasper Johns? How did he influence them?
Well, Jasper,
Keith Haring would be a good model for the 80s.
Julian Schnabel, I think they looked, the artists that came up then, Julian, Kenny Scharf, Jean-Michel Basquiat, Keith Haring, Andy hung out with Keith and Kenny and Jean-Michel like one of the boys, and he's the older, more well-known artist, but he loved being with them. He loved the energy, and it was a good feeding time. When the collaborations were done, what happened was the intellectual art establishment, and when they did the New York Times kind of Genius series, Jean-Michel was on the cover of one of them, and there was a series that was that one article and possibly another one where they say that Jean-Michel's just Andy's mascot. Andy hated that. This was not the case. This was a classic case of mentor to the younger and the older one. It was a highly creative time, and they attacked Andy as blood-sucking Dracula. They had no idea what the relationship was. Andy was trying to get Jean-Michel off heroin. Jean-Michel was the only one who could come in the afternoon when they're doing the collaboration. And start smoking a big spliff, we'd have to shut all the doors because we had other business going on. But he tolerated that because he was scared of smoke just because of fire. So they had this relationship. So Jean-Michel does separate himself. The other artists didn't, but they really loved Andy. They looked up to him, and he gave them, inspiration. And he embraced all those guys. And he didn't have to. He was a famous artist. He could have blown them off, but he embraced them, brought him in. Julian was his own big ego, so it's a little bit different. And when Andy did Julian's portrait, it's not 40 by 40. What size is it? It's like 12 feet high. It's a good portrait. It's Julian out in the field, bigger than life. And Julian's a good friend. But it's very funny how you see the different portraits. Most of the artists traded 40 by 40. But Julian did a terrific velvet painting of Andy, which was great. And Keith Haring did the Prince Andy Mouse, where Andy signed the Prince and was Andy in caricature as a Mickey Mouse. But they
collaborated with Clemente too.
Well, the first collaboration was Clemente, Jean-Michel, and Andy. And the problem with that has nothing to do with Francesco. Andy really liked Francesco, but they did their parts separately in the studios, and then they came to Andy. The chemistry wasn't working. If you read in the diaries, Andy's feeling guilty because he's connecting with Jean-Michel more, and they're starting to do work together. So Bruno, who commissioned all this, then realized that it's going to be 2, not 3. They're not as, but again, Andy really liked Francesco's work. It just wasn't working for 3 of them, and where now you have 2 of them, and they're working in the same studio, Andy's studio. So.
I'm enjoying the gossip, but I've got to leave it there. Well,
for
thank you.
heaven's sakes. I'm really getting started with gossip. Thank you.
But thank you. That was good fun. Vincent, Sally, and Stephan, thank you.